According to the U.S. Postal Service, hundreds of thousands of letters get mailed each year from children to Santa Claus. Those letters are filled with dreams and wishes, and sometimes those dreams and wishes are unrealized. Therefore, over the years, a few have responded to Santa's lack of attention to their requests and sent angry letters to him after Christmas. Like this boy named Jeremy in 2017. He wrote, "Dear Santa, I am writing this the day after Christmas, and I am very sad. I only received one of the 2 Christmas presents I asked for. Since you ate my cookies, I will assume that my missing gift was a mistake. I'll give you a week to fix this." Santa responded, "Dear Jeremy, I am sorry you were disappointed with your presents. You asked for 2 very expensive gifts, and Santa can only do so much. You need to learn to be grateful for what you do have, not upset about what you don't. If you continue to complain, I will have to add you to the naughty list next year." Jeremy couldn't just drop it at that, so he wrote a follow-up letter. "Dear Fatty, your threats don't scare me. I played your game and you did not deliver. That is not okay. I'll give you 1 week and then you'll pay. And I don't know why you care so much about how expensive it is when you have elf slaves working for you. I think you are naughty for having slaves." Santa responded, "Dear Jeremy, you are being a very bad little boy. Because you cannot be happy with what you have, I have asked your parents to take away your Wii. Once you learn to be grateful, perhaps you can have it back. You'll need to be an extra good boy this year in order to make it back onto the nice list." And Jeremy wrote one final letter. "Dear Santa, I do not like that stunt you pulled with my parents. You are on my naughty list. Be afraid. Enjoy your cookies next year because they will be poisoned." Yow! Who raised that kid, right? His letters give new meaning to the term poison pen letter. Are you familiar with that term? A poison pen letter contains unpleasant, abusive, or malicious statements. They're usually sent anonymously. Their goal seems to be the destruction of someone's a reputation, or maybe their state of mind, or maybe their life. I've received a few of those through the years. Although they were intended to inflict pain or fear, they were relatively tame compared to what some people might receive. Mine have accused me of being a false prophet or a terrible pastor or criticized my character in some way, but none of them were ongoing, one following another. Many recipients of poison pen letters through the years have had to endure far more suffering than that. In the early decades of the 20th century, a wave of poison pen attacks took place throughout Europe and the United States, including a rash of such venomous letters sent to many citizens in Vermilion, Ohio. Those written attacks throughout the world were so vicious and caused such panic that some of the victims committed suicide. Others suffered irreparable defamation. A few people died of stress that was thought to be caused by the letters they received. Some letter writers were discovered and prosecuted by authorities, but most never were. Beginning in 1977, a new flood of poison pen letters were written to many people in Circleville, Ohio. The writer or the writers of those letters apparently knew quite a bit about the recipients and threatened to expose, and in fact did expose, some of their deepest secrets to practically everyone in the community, and businesses and city officials as well. Those letters went on, thousands of them, over a period of 17 years. They led to a death, a suicide, an attempted murder, and imprisonment, and several ruined lives. That letter writing campaign was featured on TV programs like Unsolved Mysteries in 1994 and 48 Hours in 2022. But perhaps the earliest recorded poison pen letter was sent to King Hezekiah of Israel by the Assyrian king Sennacherib about 700 years before the time of Christ. We read this in 2 Kings 18, verse 13. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah's reign, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, attacked all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. That is, he attacked all the military outposts, all those cities around Jerusalem, various miles away in different places, intended to protect the capital. They were military outposts. Sennacherib demolished every one of them. He also destroyed all the major cities in the land, as well as many of the smaller ones. Sennacherib was now posed to attack Jerusalem. It was the last remaining city in Judah. But before he did, he sent a messenger to the people of Jerusalem, and he sent a threatening letter to King Hezekiah. This event is also recorded in the book of 2 Chronicles, chapter 32. And there we read in verse 9, when King Sennacherib of Assyria and all of his forces were laying siege to Lachish, he sent his officers to Jerusalem with this message for Hezekiah. And then it tells us the message. And then in verse 17, we see that the king also wrote letters insulting the Lord. The Assyrians were notorious for their cruelty. Their army was especially brutal in the attack on their enemies and in the way that they treated their prisoners of war. They had a reputation that was very threatening and fear-causing. Sennacherib, that king, recorded his history of his military conquest. He was meticulous in all the details. He would post them in places where people could read them and put them on stones so that they could be preserved for centuries, probably because he wanted his glory to outlive him, and it has. Some of his records, carved into stone panels called reliefs, were about his attacks on Israel. Here are some examples, and we'll get to those in just a minute. This attack of his military conquest on Israel focused on the city of Lachish, a military outpost about 50 miles southwest of Jerusalem. We see in this picture, for instance, Sennacherib's archers prepared to fire, and down below the picture's cut off, but more archers. And then in this photograph of the relief, there are his spearmen with their shields as they're about to attack after the onslaught of the archers. And then as we bring up the next picture, we see that the prisoners of war, the Jewish people, were brought before King Sennacherib, who set up a makeshift throne on a hill outside of Lachish to watch what happened. And here we see them prostrating themselves before him, and here we see them begging for his mercy, but none was to be found. As we go to the next picture of the next relief, we find how Sennacherib treated the prisoners of war. Some were impaled on sharp posts planted in the ground. Others were skinned alive with knives while their children watched. And then in the next photo, this one, part of the upper part of this is missing. But as we read the description of what's going on here, we think that this is Sennacherib the king. And here are some of his officials bringing the Jewish prisoners of war to him. Some of them are handcuffed, as you can see. Others have their hands outstretched, begging for his mercy. And we see his officials carrying the heads of those prisoners of war and piling them at Sennacherib's feet. And that's just the kind of man that he was, the kind of army that the Assyrians were. And that army was headed toward Jerusalem. Sennacherib wrote of this destruction on a stone obelisk. A stone obelisk was a pillar that was put into the ground, and it had four sides, and on it was printed or written the details of the battle. Here's a picture of one, and this is the one that tells the story of the Battle of Lachish and the rest of Judah. And in part it says, because Hezekiah, king of Judah, would not submit to my yoke, I came up against him, and by force of arms and by the might of my power, I took 46 of his strong-walled cities. And of the smaller towns which were scattered about, I plundered a countless number. From these places I carried off 200,156 people, old and young, male and female, together with horses and mules and camels, oxen and sheep, and a countless multitude. And so you can imagine that as the citizens of Jerusalem watched this army slowly advance toward them, taking city after city, and how cruelly they treated their countrymen, they were in panic. They were crushed in spirit. They were probably suffering a faith crisis because Hezekiah had been one of the very few godly kings that led in Israel. We read this description of him in 2 Kings 18, verses 5 and 6. It says, Hezekiah trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel. There was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, either before him or after him. He held fast to the Lord and did not stop following him. And as we read the accounts of Hezekiah's reign, we see that he led the nation in this nationwide revival. They restored worship in the temple that had deteriorated. They restored the practice of the Passover ceremony. They demolished all of the idols that were made to pagan gods scattered throughout the country. And they turned wholeheartedly to the Lord. And now this was happening to them. They needed affirmation of their faith. Sometimes we need affirmation of our faith. Things don't go exactly the way that we think that they should. Maybe we think our commitment to God, our loyalty to Him is not being repaid in the way that it should be. We wonder if God really cares for us, if He's there for us, if He's here right now. Perhaps we can learn, as the Jewish people did, from Hezekiah's example, how to find hope by turning our adversity over to God. When we face impossible odds, when we are overcome by fear, when we suffer a crisis of faith, follow the prescription of Hezekiah. And first of all, do what you can. Shift into what I call survival mode when you suffer a loss or a defeat. We cannot simply allow ourselves to be overwhelmed. We must look for a solution to our problem. We must think of a way of dealing with it. When I am counseling someone who's undergoing some problem, that's what I look for. I look for whether or not they have a survivor mentality, whether or not they're thinking about what their next step is, how they're going to deal with this. It isn't wise for me to deal with their problem for them, but to help them deal with it themselves. Real spiritual and emotional health is evident when that person begins to plan the next step, the step toward recovery. If I see that, I know they have a survivor mentality and they will overcome whatever obstacle is in their path. Hezekiah was that kind of person. And so when he knew that Sennacherib and his army was advancing toward Jerusalem, he made plans and he implemented them. We read part of that in 2 Chronicles 32, verses 2 through 6. When Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib had come and that he intended to wage war against Jerusalem, he consulted with his officials and military staff about blocking off the water from the springs outside the city, and they helped him. They gathered a large group of people who blocked all the springs and the stream that flowed through the land. Next slide, please. Why should the king of Assyria come and find plenty of water, they said. Then he worked hard repairing all the broken sections of the wall and building towers on it. He built another wall outside that one and reinforced the terraces of the city. He also made a large number of weapons and shields. He appointed military officers. And then verse 30 tells us that Hezekiah blocked the upper outlet of the Gihon spring and channeled the water down to the west side of the city. What that means is that he stopped up the springs outside the city walls so that when the army of Assyria came, they wouldn't have water so they could sustain a long siege. And in fact, he channeled that water through a tunnel that they chiseled through 1,750 feet of stone with just iron rods and sledgehammers. They worked day and night making that aqueduct to bring the water into the city so that they would have it during the time of the siege and the Assyrian army would not. It was such an amazing feat that that aqueduct still is in existence today. Israel has made it a part of their national park system. And tourists can walk the length of that aqueduct, wading through the water, and experience what the early Jewish people did 700 years before the time of Christ. But the point is, Hezekiah took action. He did what he could. When you are facing a threat, don't retreat into your fear. Don't wallow in self-pity or give up and roll over and die. You are not destined to be conquered. You are destined to be a conqueror. For Romans 8, verses 35 and 37 tells us, what shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? No. In all these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. So stiffen your backbone. Strengthen your resolve. Do what you can in the face of adversity. But sometimes, all we can do is not enough. And so that brings us to the second prescription that we find from Hezekiah's example dealing with adversity. And it's this: take your problem to God. In fact, take your problem to God and make it his problem. That's what Hezekiah did. The Assyrian king prepared to attack Jerusalem. He dictated a threatening letter to Hezekiah, giving him the choice: you can either die in war or you can live in Assyria as our slaves. Not much of a choice, is it? Then he went on to write, and don't worry about your God coming to your aid. He won't save you. He is powerless to stop me. And it seemed that he had proven his ability to back up a threat like that. And so Hezekiah turned to the one source of power he knew was greater than Sennacherib. And we read in 2 Kings 19, verses 14 and 15, Hezekiah received the letter from the messengers and read it. Then he went up to the temple of the Lord and spread it out before the Lord. And Hezekiah prayed to the Lord. He made it God's problem. In his prayer, we read that Hezekiah says, he insulted you, God. Didn't you hear him? He shouldn't go unpunished for that. And then he made this request in verse 19. Now, Lord our God, deliver us from his hand, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone, Lord, are God. What have you received that you need to spread out before God? Divorce papers, lab results, foreclosure notice, a rejection slip, overdue bills that you cannot pay, a letter from a collection agency, maybe a poison pen letter. Whatever it is, take it to God and turn it over to him. Throw yourself upon his mercy and plead for his help. And then be prepared to accept his will for your life. Sometimes we cannot change the circumstances that surround us, but we can change the way those circumstances affect us. And when you take your adversity, your problem to God and lay it before him, do it in the same way that Hezekiah did. Seek to glorify God through your adversity. Let's go back to the story again, reading verses 15 and 16, and then verse 19 once more. Hezekiah prayed to the Lord, Lord God of Israel, enthroned between the cherubim. Those are angels, by the way. You alone are God over all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth. Listen, Lord, and hear. Open your eyes, Lord, and see. Listen to the words Sennacherib has sent to ridicule the living God. Deliver us from his hand, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone, Lord, are God. Our life is to be lived to the glory of God. We live to glorify him. That same desire that Hezekiah prayed to glorify God through his adversity, we see that also in some of the other great heroes of the faith. For instance, David, when he faced Goliath, he prayed that God would glorify himself. He wasn't interested so much about him being glorified, but he wanted to glorify God through this battle that he was about to undertake. And so we read what he proclaimed to Goliath in 1 Samuel 17, verse 46. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. It was the same sentiment that was expressed, the same desire to glorify God, expressed by Elijah when he stood on Mount Carmel facing off against 850 prophets of Baal in a contest of the gods. He alone faced all of those threats, and he wanted to glorify God with what took place. And so he prayed this in 1 Kings 18, verse 37. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God. It's the same thought, the same desire that the Apostle Paul had when he prayed for God to deliver him from some physical ailment, and God told him no. We read in 2 Corinthians 12, 8 and 9, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in weakness. And then Paul adds, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly in my weaknesses. He was more interested in glorifying God through his weakness, that others would see that great works that were going on through him and know that it couldn't possibly be this weak, broken vessel that was bringing about all this victory. It had to be the power of God at work in his life. That's what Paul wanted, to glorify God. That was Holly's prayer 20 years ago this year when she was diagnosed with cancer. And we weren't sure which direction that was going. The same cancer had claimed her mother's life just a couple of years before. And she prayed, God, help me to be a witness and glorify yourself through me, either through my life or through my death. Ask God to glorify himself through your adversity. And then, finally, entrust it into his hands. Let God answer the threat you face. God gave Hezekiah an immediate answer. He sent Amos, the prophet, to Hezekiah with his answer after hearing Hezekiah's prayer. We read his answer in verses 20 and 21. It says, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I have heard your prayer concerning Sennacherib, king of Assyria. This is the word that the Lord has spoken against him. And then he goes on in a very lengthy answer, a message to Hezekiah. It begins with a condemnation of Sennacherib for insulting God. And then God spoke these words for Sennacherib in verses 27 and 28. I know where you stay and when you come and go, and how you rage against me. Because your insolence has reached my ears, I will put my hook in your nose and my bit in your mouth, and I will make you return by the way you came. I know where you live, Sennacherib. I know when you come in and out of your door. And I heard what you said. And I'm going to force you against your will back to Assyria. And then God made this promise to Hezekiah and the good people of Jerusalem in verses 32 and 33. This is what the Lord says about the king of Assyria. He will not enter this city or shoot an arrow here. He will not come up before it with shield or build a siege ramp against it. And by the way that he came, he will return. He will not enter this city. That night, the citizens of Jerusalem went to sleep. I imagine most of them slept fitfully, knowing that the Assyrian army was camped right outside their walls. But I suspect that those who really trusted God slept much better. They were waiting for God to act. And that night, he did. Verses 35 and 36 tell us what God did that night. That night, the angel of the Lord went out and put to death 185,000 in the Assyrian camp. When the people got up the next morning, there were all the dead bodies. So Sennacherib, king of Israel, broke camp and withdrew. He returned to Nineveh and stayed there. Suddenly, everything was changed. Suddenly, there was hope. By the way, as meticulous as he was about recording his history, Sennacherib uncharacteristically did not record an account of the siege of Jerusalem. He only wrote this: I shut up Hezekiah in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage, and then returned to Nineveh. There was no mention of why he broke off the siege or what became of his army. A Babylonian historian later wrote that Sennacherib's army suffered some unknown plague that defeated his forces. We know what that plague was, don't we? God's power came and suddenly ended the threat to his people. Our God is the God of suddenly, the God who provides hope in the night. So never close a book on a problem when God is involved, because he will write the final chapter. I still continue to be amazed at how God handles problems. I sometimes didn't see it coming, thought the worst was surely going to happen, when suddenly God intervened and the tide was turned and the end of the story changed. When our grandchildren were younger, they would often stay overnight with us. And I would frequently be asked to tell a bedtime story. I like to make a story up. I would set up a problem and make the situation look very bleak, and then provide an unexpected solution, a happy ending. The key word that I often used to turn the story was suddenly. Without expectation, when all seemed lost, suddenly there was hope. After telling stories that way several times, I began to notice that a smile would appear on Evan's face when he heard that word suddenly. He knew what was coming. He knew there was hope. He was happy to hear that word. We know what is coming. God's will is. God's will shall be done, Jesus taught us to pray, and we know that it brings hope. So no matter how bleak things look, there is a happy ending coming. For God comes suddenly into the picture and changes everything. When Israel would go for 400 years with an absence of God's word, he predicted this in Malachi 3:1. I will send my messenger who will prepare the way before me. Then suddenly the Lord you are seeking will come. When the disciples of Jesus were in fear and uncertainty after his crucifixion had taken place, we read that they experienced this in Matthew 28:9. Suddenly, Jesus met them. Greetings, he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshiped him. When Peter was chained in prison, after his friend James, also a disciple, had been put to death. Acts 12:7 tells us, suddenly an angel of the Lord appeared, and a light shone in his cell. Quick, get up, he said, and the chains fell off Peter's wrists. Suddenly, the Lord you are seeking will come. Remember that promise we read in Malachi 3. Ours is the God of suddenly. He changes the course of events that seem destined to follow. Maybe you can't change that course. That's okay. He can. So whatever is troubling you, put it in God's hands and wait for his suddenly to occur. The God of suddenly is here today. He's heard your prayers. He sees your pain. He feels the despair that plagues you deep inside your soul. And he's here to say that your suddenly is going to come. You entrust your problem to him. Wait on his timing. The God of suddenly is here today, inviting you to come to him and suddenly go from lost to saved by accepting his Son as your Savior. Suddenly, hope for eternity can be yours. Suddenly, the fear of death can be diminished. Suddenly, you can have security about where your life is going, even if you seem to be struggling through troubles now. The God of suddenly is your God, and he invites you to come to him. If you'd like to do that, we invite you to come forward as we stand and sing our invitation hymn.